Hi, everyone. Welcome to part 3 of the Affluent Society. Our question to think about here, what were some of the seeds of discontent evident during this era? When we talk about the seeds of discontent, we're talking about something that's just underneath the surface. So the public image of American society is this bountiful suburbs filled with middle-class families that are all helping to drive this economy and contribute to almost this Pleasantville version of society. If you've not seen the movie Pleasantville, it's a fun one to take a look at here during the quarantine. But underneath this surface of this perfection, you have this rumbling that right now in the 1950s isn't going to break through, but it's not going to be very long until it does. We have a whole series of writers and poets who are critical of the conformity and the mindset of suburbia that many Americans have latched onto. A great example of this is John Keats's book, The Crack in the Picture Window. One of the key features of those brand new suburban homes was the 6-foot picture window at the front of the house. And so this is a reference to that. John Keats ridiculed Levittowns and suburbia in general, and he criticized Americans' preoccupation with materialism and what he identified as mediocrity, that Americans were at best mediocre. He argued that Americans had lost any sense of individuality, and as he put it, Americans were living in a homogeneous post-war hell. In addition to writers like Keats, you had a small but highly visible and controversial group of young writers, poets, painters, musicians that are referred to as either beats or beatniks. And this crew is going to emerge first in New York City in the 1940s, and then you're going to find pockets of this movement throughout the country. And what's interesting about the Beats is they expressed both a sense of alienation from suburbia and the conformity, and also a sense of hope about the future. Some people have described the Beats as sort of a little bit wacky, almost like pranksters, but are critical of how serious Americans are taking themselves in the 1950s. And the beatniks are important because they are going to pave the way for a larger, widespread youth revolt of the 1960s. When we talk about the baby boomers of the 1950s and 1960s, they are really going to become a focal point of these decades. In fact, much like the 1920s, the 1950s and early 1960s are going to focus very heavily on young people. The term teenager doesn't even appear to be part of the American vocabulary until the 1930s. But once we get into the 1950s, with the baby boom generation starting to get into young adulthood, the word becomes increasingly popular. But also the trend from the 1920s continues. More families are making more money, and so fewer children have to go to work even into their teen years. So more and more young people are able to attend high school, and more young people are actually graduating from high school. In the 1950s, when you think about a teenage population, and this is even true today, is that this group in high school is essentially segregated from the rest of the population. So they have their own values, their own practices, their own language that they use that distinguishes them from the adult population. The teenagers of the 1950s are also going to make rock and roll the soundtrack of the era. This music grows out of the traditions of rhythm and blues and jazz. And it begins with Black musicians being playing for Black audiences, but it becomes popular with white teenagers and white musicians. And much like ragtime had done at the turn of the last century and jazz had done in the 1920s, and like rap and hip hop would do in later decades, this is bridging the gap between white and Black. And many adults found rock and roll disturbing for just that reason. When young white teenagers are flocking to concerts of Black artists like Chuck Berry, Little Richard, and Ray Charles, many parents found that disturbing. But others found the music itself disturbing because it challenged the sexual conservatism of the parental generation. Many found artists like Elvis Presley or Jerry Lee Lewis to be charged, raw, and sexual. Within the topic resource folder, I included several YouTube videos that show some of the artists that were famous during the 1950s. So go into that folder and have a look at some of that music. In the 1950s, the scene was described as an unfocused rebelliousness, as teenagers lashed out at the conformity of their parents and American society. So they're challenging this idea that their parents are playing into this conformity or this suburbia. But at the same time, these young people are not rejecting the values of adult consumer society. They're contributing, they're buying records, they're going to the movies, and they're not questioning the political system. But it's almost like this playful, innocent, rebellion is planting the seeds of a larger movement that's coming later. So we'll talk about that in a future topic. So coming back to our question to think about, what were some of the seeds of discontent evident during this era? Whether it was writers like John Keats or the Beatniks or young people listening to rock and roll, it all seemed very innocent in a way. But as we go into the 1960s, we're going to see this youthful rebellion blossom into a true counterculture of the 1960s.